Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel where I talk about books books in my study. Now I had a request the other day, a kind of demand that I talk about penguins, elderly penguins, because I'd kind of discounted them slightly from my rainbow shelves because orange for penguin was too obvious. So I promised to do something about the orange penguins, the classics, the modern classics in my off from my shelves. And so I've scouted around today, this morning, to pick out some favourites. It is like reaching into prehistory in a way, because this goes back many years now for me. My reading of penguins, they're not all orange, of course. Some of them are that kind of pale green of the contemporary classics. But anyway, you'll see. Oh, there were black spines, weren't there, for classics that we read in the 80s and 90s. I don't know what they all are now. They're probably something much more stylish. Everything's a bit more fancy now. These are kind of commoner garden penguins that have stayed with me forever. Now, when I was 16 and I started O level English, now that's when um, literature really took off for me in a way. Although I'd always read, obviously, I'd always read all the kids' books and things. But suddenly I saw that you could go off and do English at university. And certain writers pushed me in that direction. And one of them was D.H. Lawrence, who people don't really talk about these days so much. Sons and Lovers, that cover was so atmospheric. Those kind of very early mornings in this miner's cottage where the Morell family live. In Sons and Lovers, with that lamp and bread. And although it's probably a fancier room than they lived in Nottingham back then, actually. This painting is in Manchester. It's in the cafe of the City Gallery. And we were sat there, me and my friend Rylan was sat there drawing and having tea and stuff and cake last November, and then looked around and realised this painting was right next to us. Um, Penguin books always had paintings on the cover, and they were a bit of a education in themselves, really, just the cover. It's a painting called Evening, it's not First Thing in the Morning, by Isabel Codrington. Yes, and it's from Manchester City Gallery. And they shoved it in the cafe now. A bit like Chi Chi, the famous panda, who used to be on Blue Peter. And I remember going to London and sitting in the cafe of the Natural History Museum with a cup of tea, looking round, and there's Chi Chi, the stuffed panda, next to me in the cafe, which was kind of nice but sad. Women in Love, the sequel to Sons and Lovers. Now, this was a biggie. God, these huge, huge books full of biro underlinings. I don't think, no, this is the copy I read, I think. And I'd seen the Ken Russell movie first, which kind of pushes you in a certain lurid direction, although Lawrence is lurid enough. I think what I loved about Lawrence was it was about class. These were people I kind of recognized, and especially in Women in Love, where the working class characters are thrust into this world of bourgeois, arty, clever people and have to deal with them. And I really responded to that. And it felt to me like the Catherine Cookson characters of the novels I knew my mum read and other people in our family. And I would read anything that was in the house. So I'd read Catherine Cookson, which was about where I'd come from and the working class terraces, very like the terraced houses in D.H. Lawrence. Like Beamish, the open air museum in Tyneside, which I'd been to as a child. So I knew the 1930s and 1940s. It was very present when you lived in the Northeast. People still lived in those houses, lived with the same tablecloths and furniture and things on the wall. And I was, in my life, encountering um, kind of people from later in the century. The people who were teaching me were those who had come from similar backgrounds but had been to university. So I'd met a few Gudruns and I forget all the names of the characters. What was Gudrun's sister called? Ursula. um, no, I do forget which is which character. But you know, the collision between people of different classes was very visceral to me. Um, right, I'm going to whiz through, I think, because there's so many here. I'm not going to talk about all of them in depth. Katherine Mansfield was a big deal. I'd read a story by her in a collection that we had uh, during our A levels, and the story is called The Life of Ma Parker. Again, all about class, about somebody being drubbed down and dragged down by being a London char. She cleans for a posh gentleman, and she's carrying all this sorrow inside, and no one really cares. It's a beautiful story, slightly kind of atypical for Mansfield in some ways. This is her letters and journals, which I ate up on holiday in 2005 in Paris. My notes, I've got notes to myself and clippings. Look at this. That's somebody else, actually. That was in the book. A clipping from the Radio Times about a Radio 4 show about Mansfield. My notes are page 82, E.M. Forster warmed the teapot only. I've no idea what that's about. May 1917. Putting my weakest books to the wall last night, I came across a copy of Howard's End and had a look into it. But it's not good enough. E.M. Forster never gets any further than warming the teapot. He's a rare fine hand at that. Feel this teapot. Is it not beautifully warm? Yes, but there ain't going to be no tea. She's spilling the tea on E.M. Forster. I love this copy of Sherlock Holmes, the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Somewhere I've got a nice Penguin box set. It's in that top corner that I can't get to. I've got I've got too many boxes of papers there, but I've got the complete Holmes that Penguin did, which is nice enough. It smells of glue in the way that box set books do, um, but a worn elderly copy is much nicer, of course. This is like a kind of well-worn pair of slippers, um, and it's got some of my favourites in, of course, properly yellowed. I wish I had them all like that with these covers, which is a illustration, a photo of the corner, of course, of his room. I wonder if there's bullet holes in the wall. Yes, I think there are. Right, Jean Cocteau, Les Enfants Terribles, with his drawings. Now, this is a saucy book. Um, what I loved, this is probably the first time I encountered um, French fiction, I think. I think I read this before I read anybody else, uh, possibly before Flaubert, before Colette. And I loved Jean Cocteau anyway because I'd seen Orphée, the movie, somewhere, probably Darlington Arts Centre or somewhere, and been completely mind blown by his filmmaking, and became aware of him, of Cocteau, as a kind of multi-talented, multidisciplinarian who did these very, very homoerotic drawings, and a lot ruder than the ones in here. When you find books like the white paper or the white book, um, they're extremely saucy. But there's something about his spare line making that I really like, and it was very inspiring. They're Spartan, and so is the book. Right, Green Penguins, Mysteries, Agatha Christie and Ngaio Marsh. Death on the Nile is one of my favourites. I should do a thing about Christie. I was never a big Christie fan early on, like most people I know, but came to her much later. Ngaio Marsh, I like just as much. Now, this one, Overture to Death, is it has a very funny premise in which there's a very bossy, larger lady who bullies everybody in the village into they're doing a play, and she plays the piano each time, and she's hated. I think this is the story. Anyway, the piano is rigged to murder her. Somebody sets a kind of automated gun to go off at the climax of her playing some overture before the village pantomime. I'm probably coarsening this terribly, but that's what happens. And when when Ngaio Marsh describes it, it's extremely high camp. It's much camper than Agatha Christie ever is. A kind of robot hand comes out of the front of the piano, where the sheet music is and the little curtains, and shoots this bossy lady dead during the pantomime. But when it describes her sitting there at the piano playing, it says that she's got very long, sharp fingers playing and a very large, hard bust, which is really funny, the word bust. She's like those kind of very old-fashioned ladies where their boobs were just a kind of one big shelf, one solid rock of a woman. And you can see her. It's a very skillful piece of writing. I wish I'd kept a note of where the murder happens. You see, that's what you need, a proper murder in a book. I go back to AJ, what's it, who I was reading and gave up on the other day, where the first murder, well, the first murders happened 20 years ago, you never see them, but the first actual dead body in the book was halfway through, by which time you've given up. Right, more modern. The Accidental Tourist by Anne Tyler in Penguin, to tie in with the movie of about 1985. She is my all-time favourite novelist. She kind of reads as smoothly as Galaxy Chocolate, and it's just spare enough and just detailed enough. And there's a kind of a soothing humdrum quality, and it suits. Wow, I read this in 1990 first of all, then again in 2007, and then again more recently because I got a fancier copy. So I've read it 3 or 4 times. It suits this book, her soothing humdrumness, because it's a book about grief and somebody gradually coming back to life as he falls in love again. Yep, fantastic. And I think my favourite by her. I'm going to whiz through some more of these. Okay. Darling Buds of May, H.E. Bates. The kind of tacky ITV show of the 80s put me off reading the Larkins books for years and years because I thought they'd just be too daft to laugh at, as my nana used to say. That's too daft to laugh at. And they weren't. The books are actually lovely. H.E. Bates, again, one of his stories was in the same collection we had for A-level English. And there was a story of Bates's called Shot Actress Full Story that's all about the media and tabloid papers. That's kind of more relevant now than it was even then. So Bates has always got a kind of soft spot in my heart, although I haven't read that much. Stevie Smith, Novel on Yellow Paper. I loved her poems. I read this years ago. It's modernist and peculiar and experimental. I've made a note here, I see. Oh, this is amazing. This is some. I've underlined this bit because I've experienced the same thing. She goes off to Potsdam, where we sat in a cafe and talked for 5 hours, and that was after we had slipped around Sans Souci in felt slippers and laughed till we cried while the old guide boy was getting furious and saying his piece all the time. I underlined that clearly when I read this book because I did the same thing. I went to the Palace of Sans Souci, Frederick the Great's winter palace, which is custard yellow and covered in ornate mouldings and these bizarre tropical birds and things moulded into the walls and painted. It's a huge palace in Potsdam, near Berlin. And I went as part of a British Council thing about women writers. And there was me and a whole bunch of these amazing women. And it's when I first met Maureen Duffy and Georgina Hammack. And we went on a day trip. We skived off a morning's papers that were being given at the conference, got on a taxi and went to the Palace of Sans Souci because we'd heard it was good. And they did, in fact, make us wear huge felt slippers. She doesn't do justice to them. They were huge. And you had to slide across these polished floors, which was lethal. Georgie and Maureen both had hip replacements later in life. And we were there with Eva Rice as well. She was there, looking at all this kind of bizarre stuff. And it was a fantastic day out. I've got the photos somewhere. I dressed up as Christopher Isherwood for some, because I was in Berlin for the first time. I had this checky jacket. Yeah, I should dig out the photos. Right, Evelyn Waugh, that was back in 1996. That's 28 years ago. Evelyn Waugh, Handful of Dust. I loved Waugh again when I was doing, A levels and stuff. And this is the one I think. No, it's not. It's not. There's a different one that begins with 2 pages of unsupported dialogue. And then you realize gradually that it's a phone call, batting backwards and forwards, and you know both characters immediately. And it doesn't need any supporting stuff. You can hear the voices, like a kind of script. And then you realize this must be one of the first books to use the phone as a plot device, which is fascinating, isn't it? It's a bit like later novels using texting. And these things are kind of hostages to fortune. They can date very quickly. As, all those people who did novels about email or stuff in text speak, imagine a whole book like that. They would date very quickly, but the phone has stayed with us. And Evelyn Waugh opens whichever book that is, Decline and Fall, maybe. It should be here somewhere. Here's my copy of Christmas 1986, my copy of Hamlet. It's the Royal Shakespeare Company set texts. And I had this, it was a Christmas present, along with a whole bunch of literary classics that my mum had gone out and found because I'd made such a big deal of falling for English literature, doing A level. And I think she went to Dresser's department store in Darlington, which is long gone. It's become a pound shop or something terrible. And it used to be a lovely Edwardian department store with the book section upstairs on creaky floorboards. And it smelled wonderful because there was a perfume department and there was fancy goods. It was that kind of shop, properly Edwardian still. And she bought a whole bunch of literary classics for my Christmas that year. It's very, very touching. Things she would never have been interested in reading herself. But she'd seen, what I was really loving at school, because I've been encouraged by the English teachers that I had, by John Gallagher and Lynn Heritage, who were fantastic, and they imparted this, well, not the love for the subject, but imparted a sense that you could take it somewhere, that you could come from a school like I came from, or a town like I came from, and go and do English at university. You could become a writer, and that they made it seem possible in a very important way. So these penguins really are a reminder of that particular moment in my life. Carson McCullers, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. With all of this came revelations about not just British modernism and 19th century classics, but also about American literature and how that had developed, and the demotic, the everyday speech of American people, and how that had shaped the novels of American writers. And that was important because English writers are not always a good model for somebody from a working class background. I don't think the Americans are much more useful because they don't muck about. They are used to different vernaculars. They're used to a more colloquial, everyday speech in their fiction. The temptation to suddenly go fancy when you write fiction is instilled in British people, and it is to be avoided, I think. Yeah. That's what I think about that. And American fiction has been very useful to me for lifting uh, lifting me out of that temptation. I've just found a handful of dust. No, that was the same. I've got two copies. I still haven't found the Evelyn Waugh that begins with dialogue. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I've still got piles of these left, but I've only got through these. I'm anecdotalizing. I'll stop and make a second part of this. Okay, I'll see you soon in the next episode.